Thank you, Mr. Vice Minister, for you need to be doubly congratulated. I am very pleased to submit and to introduce to you a good friend of mine, and from the Caribbean area. I would like to thank the government of Ecuador for its hospitality, and also the Office of the United Nations for Reduction of Risks, Disaster Risks, for having invited me to this event that is of such an importance. The I would like to thank all of you for your generosity and for having shared your time at times at very late hours and after three consecutive panels. So our current research has shown that the high risk disaster is badly called natural disasters are related to the stratification and inequality that determine life of people under normal conditions. Undoubtedly, vulnerability has evolved as a concept, and today it is very widely accepted that it does refer not just to infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but also and mainly um, to a condition that is affecting certain social groups. And now we know that vulnerability is in part a social issue, and we know that uh, development is incremented and is that risks affects mostly certain groups of population, and this is trying to explore vulnerability of the social space, the physical space, and vulnerability of certain groups that are exposed to a greater potential damage, as well as limiting their capacity to react. In this context, we need to understand and examine the inequity with regard to the natural resource disasters. And in general terms, inequity is defined as a situation where some people have more rights or better opportunities than others. But going farther, um, it is necessary to understand that relations of power determine inclusion or exclusion of certain players, and that is a key aspect of the definition of inequalities. The experience of Latin American Caribbean countries is determined by the great disparities that are there between the different groups, but by the fragile and poor social structures with regard to the family life, and the migrations from the countryside to the cities because of economic reasons, and the inequalities in income and family structure, and urban growth without planning are all key factors in the renewal and in the inequity and resilience. Our region has the enviable title of being the one that has having the highest indices of inequality. And let me give you a couple of data. One out of the three inhabitants of the region is poor. In other words, does not have enough income to satisfy its basic needs. And while out of eight cannot even satisfy the basic nutrition requirements. And also we need to add that inequality also presents other aspects. In some cases, it is a higher percentage, and in others, it doesn't even surpass 15%. and this is just a lack of access to resources and opportunities, but it cannot be separated from the unequal allocation of territory and the lack of decision-making capability that is effective. And these factors are not just linked to poverty, but also are precisely defining vulnerability of the poor, and the concentration of wealth in very few hands offers privileged means to reduce to the very minimum the impacts of the impacts and consequences. The most vulnerable are the ones who bear the burden, in addition to other things that make them guilty of the conditions in which they have been forced to live. On an average, 35% of the families of the households are directed by women in the Caribbean, 42% in Barbados, 42% in Antigua and Barbuda, and without mentioning the high proportion of a country like Haiti. In these homes, the average of children who depend on a woman head of household is 1 to 5, and gender is a very interesting dimension of vulnerability here. And in as much as it is associated to socioeconomic factors, women have more potential to be unemployed. Yes, we know that, but when they have a job, when they find an employment, they usually make inferior salaries to those of men. And this gender discrimination ensures that a great number of women, who are in particular those who are heads of households, live in poverty and become vulnerable, and this relates to the disasters, and we have explored this sufficiently. In Latin America and the Caribbean have suffered an urbanization and the sprawl, which has been heightened by the internal processes of migrations with very little regulations and lack of social services. This has led to the growth of neighborhoods that are overpopulated and in which crime and violence are growing in an alarming manner, and this also affects the most humble ones. This means that we can talk about inevitable relation between the poor homes and their lack of resilience, and inexistence of public infrastructure, physical and social territories that are unsafe on the population. They are the perfect environment for disasters because natural phenomena do cause impacts on these informal settlements and squatter communities. This reinforces the fact that in these territories of poverty, the levels of education are very precarious, and because of the dynamic of the political clientelism, the planning is impossible and favors the unprivileged of these classes. These are There is a very important thing to point out. The communities are the best judges of their own vulnerabilities, and they have a greater capacity to make decisions on their own as far as their own well-being. And this means that a new strategy that incorporates the so-called marginal communities in the planning and implementation with decision-making capacity is essential to mitigate the impact and the frequency of the disasters. That we know apparently, but are we doing this? The risk reduction strategies should incorporate the economic vulnerability as a central element, and while at the same time looking to capitalize for the social communities, marginal social communities, and to redefine the relations of power. As everything that has to do with social relations, this is a matter of politics. And finally, I want to call your attention to a very important case And this has to do with something that should not happen. And I'm just referring to my city in Cartagena de Indias. It's my city. And up until the 70s, the poor people would live in resilient spaces, not just in the colonial center of the city, but also in the modern Republican neighborhoods with very few situations of extreme poverty. And in the 70s, a process of social transformation was initiated towards making Cartagena as a tourist center the most important of the city. And that constituted a true disaster for the poor people. They were sent out, they were evicted, and they continue to be displaced from the spaces where they had been for centuries in the old colonial center of the city and its surroundings, and were forced to live in other territories in flood areas that flood in the worst part of urban territories. And to this we should add the levels of corruption, political corruption, and forced migration that has migration forced by violence. So I dare to say that in the last few years, what we have been able to achieve in cities like Cartagena is the opposite. We have destroyed resilience, which at the very beginning the poor used to have in the old cities of the colony and of the 19th century. Thank you very much.